The station was always quietest just before dawn. Not silent, there was always the deep, slow breath of the building, the way wood swelled and eased in the night air, but still enough that a single drop of water from the roof's edge could be heard tracing its way down to the gravel path below. The caretaker sat at the small wooden desk by the front window, hands folded loosely, watching the light deepen by increments. Pinned to the wall opposite the desk hung a map. It had been there for as long as the caretaker could remember, fastened with brass tacks that had long since tarnished to a dull green. The map itself was an old survey print, edges curled, folds permanently creased so that certain valleys and rivers bent upward in little ridges of paper. The ink had faded into shades of dried tobacco and weak tea. There was no title, no neat line declaring a name at the top. The space where such a thing might have been printed was left blank, only the parchment's faint mottling in view. It gave the impression that the place it represented was not intended to be spoken of too loudly, as though its name had been set aside to rest. The caretaker's gaze traced the old roads, thin, hesitant lines that sometimes ended without meeting another, as if the cartographer had simply lifted their pen mid-thought. One river ran the length of the map, breaking into smaller veins that disappeared into pale terrain. Small inked marks suggested towns or way stations, but none bore the bold clarity of living settlements. And at the map's center, there was the mark. It was not quite a symbol and not quite a stain, an oval of darker ink overlaid with 3 short horizontal lines. The caretaker had noticed it many times, but never as more than a passing curiosity. It might have been a cartographer's shorthand, or the product of an idle hand. It was simply part of the map's landscape, as unremarkable as a knot in wood. The morning's first light filtered through the eastern shutters, laying a narrow band across the desk. The caretaker rose, crossed to the small stove in the corner, and set the kettle in place. This was always the first task, the grounding rhythm of the day. While the water began its slow warming, they moved through the room with practiced ease, dusting the shelves with a square of soft cloth, straightening the stack of weather records by the door, winding the station's wall clock until its soft tick became steady once more. On the shelf nearest the door, a leather satchel hung from its peg. Its strap was darkened by years of handling, the bag's sides worn supple. In its pockets lay the day's walking kit, folded paper, pencils, a canteen, and a small cloth pouch for whatever fragments the land might offer. The kettle gave a low, steady sigh as steam began to rise. The caretaker poured the water over a spoon of dried leaves, the scent mild and earthy, the colour blooming slow in the cup. They carried it back to the desk, resting it beside the map. It was not the mark that drew the caretaker's focus now, but the roads, those incomplete, fading paths. They thought of the ground beyond the station, the way certain stretches of earth held onto their shapes, despite years of wind and rain. Some of the routes on the map had surely vanished under soil and root, yet others might still wait in the pale morning light. Outside, the wind shifted, lifting the scent of dry sage into the room. It spoke of distance. The caretaker sipped their tea slowly, letting the thoughts settle. The day ahead could take them east, toward the high slope where lichen patterned the rocks, or north, where an old wooden bridge spanned the narrowest point of the river. But there was also the West Road, which, according to the map, wandered past a ridge before stopping entirely. They had never followed it to its end. They set the cup down and leaned back, listening. Beyond the walls, there was the low creak of branches and the occasional rattle of dry leaves moving against one another. Somewhere in the near distance, A small flock of birds gave a brief, murmured chorus before settling again. The leather satchel felt familiar in the hand, its weight even and ready. The caretaker lifted it from its hook, adjusting the strap across their shoulder. There was no hurry, there never was, but the ridge would be waiting, and perhaps the land would show something not recorded in ink. The kettle still held a little warmth. They poured the remaining tea into a second cup, setting it near the edge of the desk. It was a small, unspoken ritual, an offering for whoever might come after or for whoever had been before. The map on the wall caught the morning light, full now, the mark at its center no longer in shadow. The caretaker let their gaze rest there a moment longer, not with urgency, but with the quiet acknowledgement of something yet to be understood. Outside, the door's hinges gave their familiar sigh as it was opened. The first step onto the gravel path was soft, the sound muted by the dust still holding the night's coolness. Ahead, the sky carried the palest hue of gold, and the road wound away between low hills. The station, with its map and its steady clock, would keep its own company until their return. The ridge lay somewhere out there, beyond the lines where ink had stopped, and it would wait as patiently as the land always does. The day had warmed gently by the time the caretaker stepped beyond the last fence post of the station. The road ahead was less a road than a memory of one, its surface broken by long interruptions of pale grass, with patches of cracked asphalt rising like islands in a shallow sea. Each step was slow and certain, the weight of the satchel settling into a familiar rhythm against the hip. The wind moved ahead of them, carrying with it a dry, resinous scent from the sage that clung to the roadside. The plants were scattered at first, then gathered more densely where the soil dipped, their silvery leaves catching the light like dull metal. Here and there, remnants of the old world leaned in the sun. A rusted road sign stood at an angle, its surface eaten away until the lettering was little more than suggestion, curves and fragments that might once have named a place or warned of some long-forgotten hazard. The caretaker paused, tracing one of the remaining letters with a fingertip, as though by touch alone the word might reassemble itself. A little farther on, the milestone appeared. It had been placed at the road's edge by hands long gone, its numbers carved deep enough to resist most weather. Still, the digits meant nothing now, distances to towns erased from living memory. Moss clung to the stone's base, the green bright against the muted earth. Crossing the narrow rise beyond it, the caretaker came to the bridge. It was small, just enough to span the shallow seasonal wash below, but built sturdily from thick beams that had darkened with age. The boards creaked softly underfoot, but they held without protest. Leaning on the railing, the caretaker looked down into the dry bed, where stones lay scattered in patterns left by the last rains. A single feather, pale and downy, rested among them. These walks were never hurried. The caretaker's gaze lingered on details. A cluster of wildflowers sheltered at the base of a rock, the slow progress of a beetle along a splintered post, the faint shadow of a bird passing overhead. Each sight was a small entry in the unspoken ledger they carried in mind, a way of knowing the land as one might know a friend's changing expressions. It was near a bend in the road, where the asphalt gave way entirely to packed dirt, that something unfamiliar drew their attention. In the dust lay a footprint, deeper than those left by the smaller creatures that usually crossed here, but softened already by drifting sand. It faced westward, toward where the land rose into a low ridge. The caretaker crouched, studying it without touching. The print was not fresh, yet it had form enough to suggest deliberate travel. It might have been left by a wanderer weeks ago. or by someone who passed with purpose in the season before this one. They straightened slowly, glancing toward the ridge. From here, its slope was gentle, the crest blending into the pale horizon. Beyond it lay nothing recorded on the station's map, only the ink's stopping point. Still, the ridge was not for today. The light had shifted toward afternoon, and the caretaker's rule was simple. The more unknown the route, the earlier the departure should be. That way, the return could be made in the gentler hours, with time to sit and write before night closed in. Continuing along the road a little farther, they gathered a few fragments for the station's shelves. A piece of ceramic painted with fading blue spirals, the design uneven yet deliberate. A brass button dulled to a deep green patina, its center embossed with an emblem worn smooth. Each was wrapped in cloth and tucked into the satchel's side pocket. On the way back, the wind shifted again, this time from the south, carrying a faint coolness. It brought with it the smell of distant rain, not enough to promise a storm, but enough to mark a change in the air. The caretaker adjusted the satchel strap, letting the rhythm of their steps settle once more into the path's slow heartbeat. The bridge greeted them with the same gentle groan, the milestone with its mute numbers, the road sign with its half-forgotten letters. Each, in its own way, was a marker, not just of place, but of the passage of time and the constancy of return. By the time the station's roof came into view, the sun had tilted toward the west, casting long, cool shadows across the gravel path. The caretaker stepped inside, unshouldering the satchel onto the table by the window. The ceramic shard and brass button were unwrapped and placed carefully on the shelf beside other such finds, their shapes catching the day's last light. The footprint remained in thought, not as a question that demanded answering, but as a quiet note in the mind's ledger. It would still be there, if not in form, then in idea, tomorrow. For now, the kettle was set on the stove once more, its slow warming marking the close of another day's walk. The ridge, patient and unassuming, would wait in the distance until the morning called for it. The air was cool enough in the early hour that the breath lingered faintly in front of the caretaker's face. They left the station before the first solid beam of sunlight had touched the eastern hills, the satchel resting against their hip, the map folded carefully in an inside pocket. The ridge lay westward, its slope visible from the station door if one knew where to look. It was not a sharp or jagged thing, more a slow swelling of the land, rising gently before tapering into the pale sky. From a distance it seemed modest, but in the caretaker's experience, such places often held more than they showed. The path toward it was not marked, yet the ground offered its own quiet guidance. Low shrubs, spaced evenly, left narrow lanes between them. The soil underfoot was firmer, as though shaped by many passes over many years. The wind moved steadily from the north, brushing over the sage and carrying a faint mineral scent that suggested stone lying open somewhere ahead. It was a steady climb, neither taxing nor quick. Each step revealed a little more of the horizon, rolling flats to the south, a silver line of water reflecting the sky far to the east. The caretaker paused often, not out of weariness, but to let the morning light settle into the landscape, tracing the shadow lines where rock met earth. Reaching the crest, they found the land falling away into a shallow basin. The bowl of it was littered with remnants that could not have been natural. Low walls of fitted stone marked the outlines of structures, their straight lines softened by years of wind and weather. Here and there, wooden posts remained, stumps of what might have been door frames or roof supports, darkened and worn to smoothness by sun and sand. At the basin's center stood a solitary water pump. Its metal frame was speckled with rust, but the handle still rocked faintly when the wind caught it. The caretaker approached, setting a hand to the handle and pressing down gently. It gave without resistance, but the pump was dry, the sound it made low and hollow. Around its base was a ring of metal worn bright in places, as if countless hands had gripped it over years. It suggested use long after the world had changed, as though someone had kept this place functional, well into the years when most had gone to ruin. The caretaker's gaze shifted to the far side of the basin, where the rock rose in a broad, sloping sheet. There, half shaded by the angle of the morning sun, were etchings. Rows of short, curved lines arranged in deliberate patterns. They were not letters the caretaker knew, nor markings from any station record, but their arrangement tugged at a familiar place in the mind. Kneeling, they removed a glove and ran fingertips over the carvings. The stone's surface was cool, the cuts shallow but precise. Lichen had begun to grow in the deeper grooves, but enough of the markings remained clear to be copied. The caretaker withdrew a small notebook and pencil from the satchel, beginning to sketch the lines as they appeared, each curve, each gap, each subtle repetition. Halfway through, the memory surfaced. The mark on the map back at the station, the oval shape with its short horizontal lines. It was not identical, but close enough that the resemblance could not be dismissed as accident. The basin was still, save for the occasional stir of wind lifting fine dust into the air. The caretaker lingered, adding notes alongside the sketches, the size of the pump, the condition of the stone walls, the distance between the markings and the center of the basin. Each detail might matter later, even if its use was not yet clear. Before leaving, they walked the perimeter of the basin, noting where the ground shifted in color and texture. In several places, the earth was darker, as though something had been buried beneath and slowly leached into the soil. They did not disturb it. Preservation was often a form of understanding. As the sun rose higher, shadows retreated from the ridge's eastern face, leaving the basin in full light. The caretaker closed the notebook, returned it to the satchel, and stood a moment longer at the crest before beginning the slow walk back. From this height, the station's roof was a small rectangle in the distance, the map within it waiting on the wall. The mark at its center now felt less like an idle feature and more like a deliberate inclusion, though its meaning remained quiet. The ridge would be returned to. Of that, the caretaker felt certain. But now there was value in bringing the sketches home, to set them beside the map, to see what patterns might emerge when paper and memory were joined. The descent was easy, the wind now at their back. It carried with it the soft clink of metal against stone from the pump, fading until it was no more than a remembered sound. The basin lay behind them, holding its shapes and its silence as the caretaker made their way home to paper, ink, and thought. Back inside the quiet warmth of the station, the caretaker settled before the desk once again. The fading light from the window was soft now, bathing the room in a gentle amber glow that seemed to slow time itself. On the worn surface lay the folded map, its edges curling upward, and beside it, the small notebook filled with the ridge's sketches. With careful hands, the caretaker opened the notebook, smoothing the pages and studying the lines drawn so patiently in graphite. Each curve and break from the basin's rock face was traced anew beneath their gaze, the marks coming alive on the paper like whispers from a forgotten tongue. They compared these shapes to the mysterious symbol pinned at the center of the old map. Though not identical, the similarity was unmistakable. The cluster of short horizontal lines within a rounded shape, both subtle and deliberate. The caretaker fingered the inked mark on the map, as if by touch alone it might yield a secret meaning, long folded away. A faint draught stirred the room's curtains, bringing the scent of dust and dry earth from outside. The caretaker reached for the small lamp on the desk, lifting it gently and lighting the wick. The soft flame cast flickering shadows across the pages, offering a quiet company in the deepening dusk. Beside the sketches lay the day's other finds: the fragment of blue spiraled ceramic, the button green with age, and a sliver of pale wood worn smooth at the edges. Each was placed with care on a soft cloth, as though they were pieces of a fragile story waiting to be told. The caretaker rifled through a drawer and retrieved a faded folder, marked with years of careful notes, field journals left by those who had come before. The handwriting varied from neat script to hurried scrawl, but the records shared a common thread: meticulous observations of the land, of water sources, of seasonal growth. Most entries spoke of routine: soil samples, rainfall readings, animal counts. But in the margins, brief references appeared. Structures west of mile 12, one note said. Signs of tending, said another. One entry, written in a steadier hand and dated a few years before the caretaker's arrival, simply read, "The lost hamlet. Keep to the morning hours." The phrase lingered in the quiet room, hanging without explanation, like a word half remembered in a dream. The caretaker folded the folder closed, setting it gently on the desk. Outside, the world had grown darker, the wind picking up a faint whisper against the wooden shutters. The caretaker sat back and let the small flame's warmth fill the space, eyes drifting once more to the map's silent symbol. It seemed less like a mystery now, and more like an invitation to look deeper, to listen more closely. The caretaker reached for their pen and began sketching again, this time outlining a small circle around the map's mark, connecting it visually to the basin's carvings. They wrote a note alongside: echoes of care or a language of place. Such questions did not demand immediate answers. Instead, they were stones dropped into a still pond, ripples spreading outward, slow and steady, inviting the mind to wander without pressure. In the room's soft hush, time felt suspended between past and present, the faint tick of the wall clock, the only sound steady enough to hold on to. The caretaker's thoughts drifted toward tomorrow's steps, returning to the ridge, perhaps following the line of the lost road westward, searching for more clues buried beneath soil and shadow. For now, the station offered sanctuary, a place to gather fragments, to trace connections, and to rest. The flame flickered low, the night deepened, and the quiet beckoned, promising that the story would continue gently with the coming dawn. The next morning dawned pale and still, a delicate wash of soft pink and grey light spilling slowly over the horizon. The caretaker rose with the quiet certainty of habit, moving through the station with measured steps. Today's journey would follow the old note from the archives, west of the forgotten mile 12, toward a place called only in passing, the lost hamlet. The road had faded nearly to memory by the time the caretaker reached its supposed beginning, a low dip where cracked stones peeked through spreading moss and wild grass. The air was cool and moist from the evening's light rain, the scent of wet earth rising faintly with the gentle breeze. Every sound was hushed, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Walking slowly, the caretaker traced the path's barely visible contours. Patches of broken brick and weathered stone emerged beneath the overgrowth, scattered like scattered whispers from another time. The buildings, once clustered close, were now defined only by their stone foundations, worn smooth by rain and wind. One structure stood apart, or perhaps had simply held its shape a little longer. It was roofless, but the walls framed the empty space like a memory made tangible. Inside, a wooden table remained upright, its surface mottled but level, despite years exposed to sun and sky. Atop the table rested a single object, a glass jar, its sides clouded with dust and age. Within, seeds lay still, pale and whole, untouched by decay. A scrap of faded cloth was tied loosely around the jar's neck. Upon this fabric, the caretaker saw it again. The same subtle symbol that had marked the map echoed in the basin's carvings. The caretaker reached out but paused, choosing to leave the jar undisturbed, a quiet offering left for time itself to keep. Instead, they noted its place carefully in the worn notebook, the coordinates and surroundings recorded with the precision of a gentle witness. Outside, the sun rose higher, scattering shafts of light through the skeletal remains of wooden beams and shattered windows. The hamlet felt less like a ghost town and more like a sacred place, preserved in quiet solitude. As the caretaker turned to leave, a soft rustling in the nearby brush caught their attention. A small animal, perhaps a rabbit, slipped away, vanishing into the undergrowth without hurry or fear. The path home was slow and reflective, steps measured beneath the drifting sky. The seeds in the jar, the symbol, the careful preservation, all wove together into a pattern still elusive but growing clearer in the mind's eye. Back at the station, the caretaker arranged the day's notes on the desk. The pieces were many and small, but each held the weight of intention, of care, reaching across years and silence. The hamlet was not simply lost. It was tended to, remembered in the quiet language of objects and places. It waited for understanding, and the caretaker felt that their journey was only beginning. Outside, the wind whispered softly through the empty streets, carrying the promise of stories yet to unfold. The morning was still and pale as the caretaker returned once more to the station, their satchel lighter but their thoughts heavier with quiet questions. The fragments gathered from the lost hamlet and the ridge had settled into a soft pattern, a language not yet spoken but felt beneath the surface of the land. Inside the small archive room, the caretaker pulled open a worn cabinet filled with folders marked by time's patient hand. These were the records left by those who had walked these same paths long before, their words preserved in faded ink and carefully folded pages. The oldest of these journals bore a neat, deliberate script, signed only with a single initial. Their entries spoke not just of measurements and weather, but of seasonal tending and quiet repairs, phrases repeated like a ritual across the margins. The caretaker's fingers traced the lines, noting mentions of plantings, stone clearing, and the slow work of patching walls against wind and rain. Between two pages, a pressed flower slipped free, fragile and faintly colored despite its age. The petals were small and rounded, matching those seen growing near the basin at the ridge. It was a tangible thread connecting past and present, a quiet testimony to care carried across years. The caretaker arranged these older notes alongside their own journal, aligning dates and observations. Among the records was a half-finished entry, its final words smudged and trailing off mid-sentence, as if the writer had simply set their pen down and walked away. This absence hung in the quiet air like a gentle invitation. What had interrupted the work? What remained unseen beneath the soil and stones? The caretaker folded the papers with reverence, placing them carefully back in the cabinet. The knowledge here was subtle and patient, growing not from loud declarations, but from steady hands and quiet attention. Outside the window, the wind stirred the dry grasses, carrying a faint hint of distant rain. The land, like the records, was shaped by care, repeated through seasons, a slow tending that bridged absence and presence. As evening approached, the caretaker sat at the desk and wrote a brief note to themselves. Continuity in quiet hands. It was less a conclusion and more a soft promise. To follow these traces, to listen to the land's patient voice. The night deepened beyond the window pane, the familiar hum of the station's clock steady and sure. Outside, the ridge awaited once more, its stones holding secrets folded beneath shadow. The caretaker felt a calm certainty. The story was unfolding, not in haste, but in steady rhythm, like the slow turning of the earth itself. The morning air was crisp and light, a gentle quiet holding the land in a soft embrace. The caretaker stepped outside the station with a purpose tempered by patience. Today's task would take them beyond the ridge and the hamlet, seeking voices carried not on paper, but through the living land itself. The path led first to a nearby grove of slender trees, their leaves whispering in the morning breeze. Here, the caretaker paused to listen, not for words, but for the subtle sounds that told stories in their own language. The rustle of branches, the soft tap of woodpecker against bark, the distant cry of a hawk circling above. Near the grove's edge, the caretaker found a weathered bench, worn smooth by time and quiet visits. The wood carried the scent of pine and earth, and beside it lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it gently, the caretaker revealed a collection of simple objects: a carved stone, a feather, a piece of thread twisted into a loose knot. Each held meaning beyond what was immediately visible, as if the hands that had placed them here had spoken softly across the years. The caretaker touched the feather lightly, noting its pale pattern that echoed the shapes etched at the ridge. From here, the journey wound onward toward an abandoned radio tower, a skeletal structure reaching into the sky. The caretaker climbed carefully, the metal cool and steady beneath their fingers. At the top, the horizon spread wide, a tapestry of muted colors and soft hills. The radio equipment, long silent, still held faint traces of messages sent in the past. A broken recording left looping on an old tape, fragments of coded phrases that hinted at connection and caution. The caretaker listened with patience, recording the sounds and the spaces between them, translating them into notes in the growing journal. Each fragment felt like a step closer, a voice threading through the quiet distances. Descending as the sun arced higher, the caretaker moved toward the river's edge. Here, the water flowed steady and clear, its surface catching the light in soft ripples. On a smooth stone, initials were carved delicately, an old mark of passage, a sign of presence. The day's journey ended back at the station, the satchel fuller with new stories woven not from ink, but from wind, wood, and water. The caretaker set the collected pieces carefully on the desk, their arrangement deliberate and thoughtful. The voices on the wind were not loud or urgent, but patient and steady, inviting deeper listening. They promised that the story held more layers than any single map or symbol could show. As twilight settled, the caretaker looked once more to the fading symbol on the wall map. The questions persisted gently. What had been lost, what remained, and how care had been carried through the silence. Outside, the breeze softened, carrying with it the hush of night and the promise of quiet dreams. Evening had settled softly over the station, draping the landscape in muted hues of deep blue and lavender. The caretaker sat by the window, the fading light casting gentle shadows across the desk, where notes, sketches, and small artifacts were spread with careful order. Each item carried a fragment of story, a whisper from the past woven into the present, their thoughts turned inward, weaving together the strands of place and time gathered so far. The symbol on the map, once a simple mark of ink and paper, began to feel like a signature, not of ownership, but of stewardship. A subtle trace of hands that had tended the land, cared for its fragile balance, and left signs not of conquest, but of quiet guardianship. The ridge basin, with its worn pump and carved stones, suggested a community not lost, but living in a different language. The seed jar in the abandoned hamlet whispered of hope preserved against the silence of years. The voices carried on the wind, the feather, the carved stone, the broken radio messages, spoke less of isolation and more of connection. The caretaker reflected on the records from the past caretakers, those quiet hands that had measured rain, tended soil, and patched walls. Their work was not about grand gestures, but about persistence, the slow, steady attention that allows life to endure even when the world changes around it. It was a kind of stewardship that required patience and trust, a belief that small acts ripple outward beyond immediate sight. The caretaker realized that the landscape itself was a living record, not just of events, but of care, memory, and presence. As the night deepened, a soft breeze moved through the room, lifting the curtains gently. The caretaker traced the symbol on the map again, this time with a sense of calm acceptance. It was an invitation to join this lineage of tending, a quiet promise that even in loss, continuity endures. The world outside hummed with the whoosh of settling dark, and distant stars began to scatter across the sky. The caretaker felt the steady rhythm of time, the slow turning of seasons, and the gentle unfolding of stories, not in loud declarations, but in whispered continuity. With a final note in the journal, care is the quiet thread that binds. The caretaker closed the book and prepared for rest. Outside, the ridge stood silhouetted against the night, patient and still. Sleep was welcome here, a soft landing after the day's slow journey through memory and place. The story was not finished. It was simply waiting, like the land itself, for the next morning's light. The morning arrived wrapped in a soft haze, the sun barely breaking through a veil of pale mist that settled low over the land. The caretaker moved steadily through the station's routine, their hands familiar with the quiet tasks that marked each day, tending the small garden by the window, adjusting the shelves of carefully catalogued fragments, and preparing a simple meal to carry along the road. Today was reserved for reflection and connection. The sketches from the ridge, the notes from the hamlet, and the worn artifacts were spread gently across the desk, each one a quiet thread in a growing tapestry. The caretaker traced lines between them, not with urgency, but with steady curiosity. The soft mapping of relationships, like watching the slow bloom of a flower. The notebook's pages whispered of patterns, the repetition of the symbol, the shared shapes etched in stone and ink, the recurring presence of care in the form of preserved seeds, tended land, and thoughtful repair. These were not random marks, but a language of place, a gentle conversation between past and present. The caretaker lifted the small button from the desk, its worn emblem catching the soft light. It was a humble object, but in it was the quiet dignity of those who had worn it, who had lived with intention even when the world had shifted beneath their feet. A faint breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of sage and warm earth. Outside, the distant hum of insects blended with the occasional call of a bird, natural rhythms that wove seamlessly into the caretaker's quiet work. Throughout the day, the caretaker moved between notes, artifacts, and the fading light, letting the connections form without pressure. The story was not one of sudden revelation, but of patient assembling, a gentle weaving that honored the slow passage of time. As afternoon stretched into evening, a subtle thought emerged. Perhaps the symbol was less a secret code and more a mark of belonging, a signature of those who chose care over abandonment, tending over erasure. The caretaker's hand rested lightly on the map, circling the area where all these places converged. It was a quiet map, not of grand battles or loud histories, but of human presence threaded through quiet persistence. As the sky deepened to twilight, the caretaker closed the notebook with a soft sigh, their thoughts already turning to the next steps, to follow the soft trail of care outward, to listen again to the land's whispered stories. Outside, the evening air settled like a soft cloak, and the station held its breath in peaceful watchfulness. The day began with a gentle light filtering through the station's dusty windows, a soft glow that seemed to settle around the caretaker as they prepared for another quiet journey. The satchel was packed slowly, with care, each item chosen thoughtfully. The notebook, a small bundle of tools, and a weathered scarf wrapped neatly for the cooler air ahead. This morning, the path led toward a cluster of trees where the land seemed to fold into itself, a natural meeting place that had drawn visitors long before the world shifted into its current quiet form. The caretaker walked with a steady step, attuned to the subtle signs that marked the way: trampled grass, a carefully placed stone, the faint scent of smoke carried on the breeze. Arriving at the grove, the caretaker found traces of recent presence. A small fire pit, surrounded by stones darkened from use, and near it, carefully arranged piles of gathered wood and gathered herbs. It was a scene of gentle intention, a place maintained with respect and care. The caretaker settled nearby, opening the notebook to add new observations. They traced the shapes of the nearby stones, noting the way the small gatherings suggested a rhythm, a cycle of arrival, tending, and departure that felt neither hurried nor anxious, but measured and deliberate. From the edge of the grove, a soft voice called. A greeting carried lightly on the wind. A figure emerged, weathered yet steady, offering a quiet smile, and the kind of calm that comes from years of thoughtful presence. The two shared a moment of simple connection, exchanging small gifts, a handful of dried berries, a folded cloth embroidered with a pattern matching the symbol found at the ridge. This meeting, unhurried and unspoken, spoke volumes of trust and belonging. It was an affirmation that care was a shared language, one that did not require loud words or swift actions, but was built slowly through repeated acts of presence and respect. As the sun arced higher, the caretaker and visitor parted with a quiet nod, each returning to their separate paths, yet bound by the unspoken thread of community. Walking back to the station, the caretaker felt the weight of this trust settling deep, a gentle anchor amid the soft currents of the day. The symbol on the map no longer felt like a solitary mark, but like a beacon, a shared signature of those who tended the land and each other with steady hands. That evening, as light softened into dusk, the caretaker set the new notes alongside the artifacts, each piece a quiet testament to the enduring rhythm of care. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of continued stories and the comfort of connection. The morning light crept softly through the station's windows, casting long, muted shadows across the desk, where the caretaker sat surrounded by notes and artifacts. The day began not with urgency, but with a deliberate calm, a steady ritual of organizing, reflecting, and preparing for what lay ahead. The caretaker's hands moved slowly over the collected pieces, sketches of the ridge carvings, pressed flowers from earlier days, and the worn seeds preserved in glass. Each was a symbol of continuity, a quiet testament to lives intertwined with the land's gentle rhythms. Outside, the wind stirred the tall grasses, their soft rustle blending with the faint hum of distant birds. The caretaker paused to listen, breathing in the cool air scented faintly with sage and earth. Today's journey was inward as much as outward, a meditation on the meaning behind the traces left behind. The records from previous caretakers spoke of stewardship not as a task, but as a covenant, a promise made through small, repeated acts of care that wove people and place into an enduring whole. The caretaker opened a worn journal, reading a passage penned decades before. To tend is to hold space, for growth, for change, for return. It is the patient hand that guides without grasping. This idea settled gently in the caretaker's mind, resonating with the quiet work of each day. Stewardship was less about control and more about listening, tuning into the subtle shifts of soil and sky, honoring the stories etched into stone and seed. The station itself felt like a living symbol of this covenant, a place where history and present met without clash, where the slow pulse of care marked each moment with quiet dignity. As the sun moved slowly across the sky, the caretaker arranged a new set of notes beside the old, connecting observations with thought and feeling. The symbol that had appeared again and again now seemed less a mystery and more a shared mark of respect and belonging. Evening fell with a soft hush, the land settling into night's embrace. The caretaker closed the journal, feeling a calm certainty that stewardship was a gentle thread running through time, a quiet covenant linking all who had walked these paths. Outside, the stars began to emerge, faint points of light in the deepening sky, and the station stood steady, a quiet refuge amid the vastness. Sleep came easily here, beneath the watchful presence of land and sky, carrying the promise of care continued beyond the day. The dawn unfolded gently, pale and slow, as if the world itself was breathing in rhythm with the caretaker's own steady pulse. Light filtered softly through the station's windows, touching every surface with a warm, muted glow. The day was calm, inviting a final gathering of thoughts and memories before rest. The caretaker moved through the familiar spaces with a quiet grace, collecting journals and notes, smoothing sketches with tender fingers. Each piece held a story, a gentle thread woven through the landscape of time and care. Outside, the ridge rose steadily against the horizon, its shape softened by distance and light. The basin below shimmered faintly in the morning haze, the carved stones and dry pump resting patiently beneath a sky brushed with soft clouds. The symbol on the map, once a mystery, now felt like an old friend, its curves and lines echoing the rhythms of the land itself. It was a mark of continuity, a quiet signal that care and presence had persisted through years of silence. The caretaker settled at the desk, arranging the collected pieces with a deliberate tenderness. The pressed flower, the seeds in their glass jar, the faded cloth, the delicate sketches, all stood together as a testament to a story not lost, but patiently held. The soft hum of the station's clock was a steady companion, its slow tick marking moments of calm reflection. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the subtle scent of sage and earth. As evening approached, the caretaker closed the journal with care, a final note tucked inside. In quiet tending, the world remains alive. The room grew darker, the land outside folding into shadow and stillness. The ridge stood as a silent witness, patient and enduring. The caretaker's thoughts drifted to rest, the day's gentle journey complete. Sleep was a soft landing here, beneath the steady watch of land, sky, and time itself. Outside, the world whispered a lullaby, inviting all to pause, to breathe, and to dream. Night had fully settled over the ridge and the valley below, wrapping the world in a quiet shroud of shadow and soft light. The station's windows held the faintest glimmer of stars, their distant sparkle gentle and steady, like a silent choir watching over the land's slow breathing. Inside, the caretaker sat by the desk one last time, the scattered notes and artifacts gathered now into a neat pile, a tender archive of stories held in careful hands. The small lamp's flame flickered softly, casting a warm glow that seemed to steady the room's gentle rhythm. The symbol, etched in stone, drawn on maps, stitched into cloth, rested at the center of the caretaker's thoughts. It was no longer just a mark, but a sign of belonging and quiet covenant. A message written not in loud calls, but in the tender language of care. Outside, the wind moved softly through the grasses, carrying the faint scent of sage and earth. It was a lullaby sung by the land itself, an invitation to pause, to breathe, and to rest. The caretaker's eyes closed briefly, a soft exhale releasing the weight of the day. Sleep was near, welcoming, gentle, and kind. In this whispered land, stories live not in hurried tales, but in slow, steady tending. They live in the careful steps taken, the seeds preserved, the hands that reach out quietly across time. And so, with the night holding its watch, the caretaker lay down their pen, and the room settled into calm. The ridge waited, patiently, the basin breathed softly, and the land whispered its timeless lullaby. Sleep now, in the quiet embrace of the world. The world beyond the ridge lay quiet under a veil of twilight, soft shadows folding gently into one another. The caretaker stepped once again into the cool evening air, where the whisper of grasses and the distant call of night birds traced the contours of a place both ancient and alive. Tonight, the journey was less about discovery and more about listening, tuning into the subtle echoes that stretched beyond the familiar bounds of the station and the basin. The caretaker moved slowly along a worn path, guided by the fading light and the quiet pulse of the earth beneath their feet. Here, the land told stories, not in words, but in patterns. The way stones had been carefully arranged to guide water, the subtle dips in the soil where roots had taken hold, the faint traces of footsteps that spoke of those who had come before. The caretaker paused to trace a shallow groove in the earth, their fingers feeling the cool texture of weathered stone. This was a place of connection, a threshold where past and present met in silent conversation. As night deepened, the stars emerged one by one, their light soft but steady, like gentle watchfires in the vast sky. The caretaker lifted their gaze, letting the quiet vastness settle around them. In these moments, the meaning of the symbol found throughout the ridge and hamlet seemed to expand, no longer a simple mark, but a bridge linking generations, a testament to the enduring rhythm of care and presence. Returning to the station, the caretaker felt a sense of calm completion, a quiet understanding that stories live not just in places, but in the spaces between, in the pauses, the silences, and the gentle breath of the land itself. The lamp flickered low, the night deepened, and the world folded into rest, inviting all who listened to settle gently into sleep. Night draped the land in a soft, velvety darkness. The stars scattered quietly across the sky like distant beacons of calm. The caretaker sat by the window, watching as the world held its breath in gentle stillness. The familiar hum of the station, a steady heartbeat beneath the vast quiet. Tonight was a time for reflection, not of endings, but of continuities. The stories gathered over days and seasons unfolded softly, weaving together threads of care, presence, and gentle tending that stretched beyond any single moment. The symbol, now a quiet companion in the caretaker's thoughts, shimmered in memory like a delicate stitch, binding the ridge, the hamlet, and all the spaces in between. It was a promise made in silence, that even in absence, care endures, that the slow rhythms of kindness ripple outward, unseen, but always felt. The caretaker's hands rested lightly on the desk, where the accumulated notes and sketches lay folded like petals. Each held a whisper of lives lived with intention, of places held safe by steady, loving attention. Outside, the night wind carried the faint scent of sage and earth, a lullaby sung by the land itself. The world seemed to breathe in unison with the caretaker, a slow exhale of peace and belonging. The journey had been gentle, a patient unfolding of story rather than a rush toward resolution. Here there was no hurry, only the soft cadence of presence, the quiet thread that connects past, present, and tomorrow. As eyelids grew heavy, the caretaker gave a final, slow breath, inviting rest and renewal. Sleep now, wrapped in the whispered land's embrace. The ridge waits patiently for the dawn, and the story will continue, softly, surely, always.